I welcome everybody. Thanks for being here today. Our speaker, we're very grateful to have Fahad Nazer, is the official spokesperson for the Embassy of Saudi Arabia to the United States. He was appointed to his role in January 2019. Prior to this appointment, he was a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and served as an international fellow at the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. Additionally, he was also a columnist for the daily newspaper Arab News. His publications have appeared in Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, CNN, Foreign Policy, Yale Global Online, The National Interest, and Newsweek. He's earned his BA in Political Science from New York University and an MA in Political Science from St. John's University in New York City. He's also completed the credit and examination requirements of the PhD program in Political Science at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us. We're looking forward to your presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and thanks to the World Affairs Council for the kind invitation. Let me start by saying that Saudi Arabia is currently undergoing what I would argue is the most consequential transformation in the world. And I use the word consequential because of where Saudi Arabia sits in the international community. So I think I'm pretty sure all of the audience, everyone watching, knows that Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of Islam. It is also the location of its two holiest sites in Mecca and Medina. And because of that, there's an expectation among Muslim majority nations for Saudi Arabia to play a leadership role in addressing some of the challenges that the broader Muslim community faces. At the same time, there's a similar expectation among Arab majority nations for Saudi Arabia to play a leadership role, and again, addressing the challenges that the Arab world faces, obviously for different reasons. I think the primary reason is the fact that Saudi Arabia is the biggest economy in the Arab world. It is also the only member state of the group of the G20 group of nations. On a third front, there's also an expectation, I think an even broader expectation in the broader international community and among both oil producing nations as well as oil importing nations for Saudi Arabia to play a leadership role in making sure that international energy markets are stable and adequately supplied. And in many ways, we have embraced all of these expectations out of the belief that we are living in an increasingly interconnected global community. And many of the challenges that we do face are, in fact, global in nature and do require collective efforts. So, more specifically, the transformation that I referred to at the outset is something we call Vision 2030. And the vision was unveiled by His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, back in 2016. The broad objectives of the vision is the empowerment of every segment of Saudi society, and also the development of every sector of the economy. At the same time, we are completely, and we have already, completely revolutionized the way that we deliver government services. Now, more specifically, the vision's objectives are aimed at reducing our dependence on oil revenues, by diversifying our economy. So, for instance, we had an economic model in place that worked pretty well for us for many years. Just to give you an example, back in 1970, our population was all of 5 million. Last year, we conducted what was probably the most comprehensive census and found that we actually just crossed 35 million people. Now, that's a sevenfold increase. So I mentioned 1970, because the economic model that we had in place back then was fine and it worked, again, when the population was significantly smaller. However, today, as the population has increased, some would say dramatically over the past 50 years, we needed a new model. So Vision 2030 is offering us this model. There's a number of sectors that we are investing heavily in that are kind of leading this transformation and diversifying the economy. So I'll just mention a few of them just to kind of give you a flavor of what's happening in the kingdom. So one of them is the fact that we are investing heavily in our mining sector. Again, last year we conducted what was probably our most comprehensive geological survey, and it found that we have $2.4 trillion worth of metals and minerals that could be extracted and developed, and obviously generating with the potential to generate billions of reals and dollars to our economy, and to generate thousands of jobs to both men and women. At the same time, if you look at, I don't have a map, unfortunately, but if you look at a map of where Saudi Arabia sits geographically, we are kind of strategically located at the intersection of three continents: Europe, Africa, and Asia. And because of that, we are investing heavily in our seaports, in our airports, in our information networks, out of the belief that we can play the role of we can become a logistics hub, but also a connector that can facilitate the transfer of goods and services and information between the global north and the global south, for lack of a better term. At the same time, we are, in a very short amount of time, we've transformed Saudi Arabia into a global tourism destination. Now, as we speak, and in fact, the Minister of Tourism just yesterday spoke at the World Economic Forum, in Davos yesterday, and spoke about the numbers, the tourism numbers. So we currently have the fastest growing tourism sector in the world. As of last year, we had over 120 million people visited Saudi Arabia for tourism purposes. Now, that does include domestic tourism, and it does include what we refer to as religious tourism. But even if you exclude those numbers, 27 million people visited Saudi Arabia last year for non-religious tourism purposes. Now, that's a huge leap forward for us. And these numbers are continuing to increase because we believe we offer tourists kind of a unique experience. We have 8 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Saudi Arabia, maybe the most famous of which is a site called Al-Ula, which is the Nabatean capital in the northwest of Saudi Arabia. We have the ancestral home or the first capital of the first Saudi state just outside of Riyadh, and we have some pretty amazing beaches and diving spots and mountain trails. So, we've issued a call. We've invited people to come to Saudi Arabia. We've made it very easy for tourists to visit the kingdom. We've become very accessible. So, for instance, for Americans, all it takes is an online visa, and it takes, it's my understanding that it takes mere minutes. But to make it even easier, we've actually offered visa on arrival for Americans and dozens of other nationalities. So people have, we've made the call, we've invited people in, we've made ourselves accessible, and people are coming. And again, tourism is not only, it's one of these sectors that is a win-win in the sense that, even though we have all these technological innovations today, tourism is still very much a labor-intensive sector. So we still need men and women to run the tourism sites, the hotels, and all the industries that it supports. At the same time, like I said, tourism is a great sector because it really allows people from the outside to have a better understanding of Saudi Arabia. So that's a sector that we're very, we're on the right track. We've made tremendous strides, and it's already generating billions of dollars to the economy. Our goal, I believe that last year it contributed 3% to our economy. I think our goal is 10%, and we are well on our way. At the same time, Saudi Arabia has some pretty interesting, unique projects that are kind of on the cutting edge of science and technology. And maybe the most famous of which, or the one that has received the most attention, is a project, or a giga project, as some people call it, called NEOM. NEOM is basically a smart city that is being built from the ground up. It is in northwest Saudi Arabia. It is approximately the size of Massachusetts. It is going to have several sectors. It's going to have a tech sector, a business sector, an education sector. It's also going to have a manufacturing sector. But also, as we speak, NEOM has already begun as becoming a tourism destination because it is on the Red Sea, and some of the tourism destinations or resorts are already up and running. There's also plans to. There's also a very important and a critical component, kind of a sporting sector, sports and entertainment sector of NEOM, and we're going to host several international events in NEOM starting as soon as 2029. What's interesting about NEOM, and I've had really the pleasure of speaking with some of the people who work on it, including dozens of Americans, and they describe it this way. They say that in NEOM, the thinking in NEOM is that they are trying to demonstrate that human beings can live in complete harmony with nature by employing the most advanced technologies available. I think that's a very interesting and unique project. The entire project is going to be powered exclusively by renewable energy. It will safeguard the ecosystem of the area. 95% of the area is not going to be affected. So it's a very unique project. It is very forward-looking. And once all is said and done, we believe that it will create or represent a huge leap forward in urban living. But not only that, Saudi Arabia is also playing a very important role, and I think we've become leaders, certainly regionally, in terms of addressing climate change. Climate change is obviously maybe the ultimate global challenge. It's something that every country has to do and play its part to address, because you can have the cleanest water, the cleanest air possible, but if your neighbors are not adopting similar policies, then obviously it becomes just an exercise in futility. So back in 2019, we unveiled something called the Saudi Green Initiative, and basically it has a number of programs. One of it is the fact that we are investing heavily in renewable energy, solar, wind, but also green and blue hydrogen. At the same time, we've adopted something called the circular carbon economy, and basically it's usually comprised of 4 Rs, and I typically forget one of them, but it's basically the aim is to reduce, reuse, remove carbon emissions. So we are kind of walking on 2 tracks, out of the belief that climate change is a real threat. And again, for people who are familiar with the region, it's something that not just Saudi Arabia faces, but we've had, obviously there's desertification, there's dust storms and other challenges, in addition to endemic water scarcity. That's always been a challenge. So not only do we have the Saudi Green Initiative, but we've also unveiled something that we call the Middle East Green Initiative. Again, the thinking here is that combating or mitigating the impact of climate change just cannot be a unilateral move. It has to be collective. So we are sharing some of the technologies that we're adopting with our neighbors, and also some of the know-how with our neighbors. Just as an example, things like early warning systems to make sure that our neighbors are prepared for climate events. And again, the idea is that this has to be a collective effort, because there is no such thing as unilateral efforts to address climate change. And given obviously the interests of the World Economic Council, I'd love to say a few words just about our foreign policy. And our foreign policy, really, to a great extent, is meant to complement Vision 2030 and to help us achieve some of its goals. Because while much of the objectives of Vision 2030 are kind of focused on Saudi Arabia, on our economy, but some of them, like I already mentioned, becoming a global tourism destination, becoming a global logistics hub, requires the broader Middle East to enjoy, some semblance of peace and prosperity and stability. So we realize that we cannot achieve some of these goals without having some, peace and order and stability in the region. So, our foreign policy is fairly consistent. It is fairly straightforward, and it's very clear. We adhere very strictly to a set of principles that have allowed us over the years to enjoy excellent relations with the majority, overwhelming majority, I'd say, of nations around the world. So some of these principles include, we are strong believers in collective action, in multilateral approaches. Again, out of the belief that a lot of the challenges that we face today are indeed global in nature. So, we are big supporters of the United Nations, multilateral efforts, or some of the other regional organizations that we're members of. We are big believers in diplomacy, including quiet, behind-the-scenes diplomacy. We always leave a channel of, we believe in having a robust channel of dialogue open. We do not support any militant non-state actors, regardless of their orientations. We're always supportive of internationally recognized state institutions, internationally recognized governments. And we also strongly believe that we do not interfere or intervene in the domestic affairs of our neighbors or any countries, for that matter. And because of that fact, we have often been uniquely positioned to play the role of honest broker, not just between nations, but even sometimes between factions within nations. I think we have a pretty good track record that goes back several decades, just in terms of mediating between various factions. So I think the track record goes back to 1990, when Saudi Arabia played a very important role in bringing an end to the Lebanese civil war. That war had been raging for 15 years at that point, but we managed to hold a conference in Taif in Saudi Arabia and brought all the different parties in. And the agreement that brought that war to an end was indeed called the Taif Agreement. More recently, we helped mediate between Eritrea and Ethiopia and brought that longstanding conflict to an end. We've even offered to mediate between Ukraine and Russia, out of the belief that, again, we maintain a good relationship with both countries, and we've maintained that channel with both countries because we believe that whether it's the war in Ukraine, the war in Sudan, the crisis in Yemen, but even the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for that matter, all of these conflicts require political dialogue and political resolution. So we've done what we can in terms of promoting and trying to offer to mediate, like I said, sometimes between factions within countries, as we did with Lebanon, but we've also tried to do it with Sudan. When this conflict broke out a couple of years ago, we've also invited all sorts of stakeholders from Yemen to, again, have a dialogue to hopefully bring us to a political resolution as well. At the same time, obviously, given where I sit in Washington, D.C., obviously, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, end my remarks by saying a few words about the importance of Saudi-U.S. relations. And, I've long maintained that Saudi-U.S. relations are critical. They are longstanding, and they are multidimensional. Not only have they endured for some 80 years at this point, but they've actually continued to grow and to deepen and to strengthen under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Like I said, the relationship in many ways is multidimensional. It includes political cooperation in a number of fronts. I've already mentioned the fact that Saudi Arabia and the United States are working closely to try to bring peace and stability to Yemen, to bring peace and stability to Sudan, obviously to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict once and for all. But there's also an important military component of the relationship that includes regular military, joint military training. But not only that, but I often like to remind my audiences that Saudi Arabia and the United States have fought not one, but two wars side by side over the years. The first one was in 1990, when we helped expel Saddam Hussein's troops from Kuwait. More recently, going back to 2014, 2015, again, our forces fought side by side to expel the terrorist group ISIS from Syria and Iraq. At the same time, the relationship also has a very important economic component. The trade in goods and services between our two countries, according to U.S. government figures, supports 165,000 American jobs here in the United States on an annual basis. The total value of trade in goods and services between our two countries last year was around $40 billion. What's interesting about that is that, some American companies have been in Saudi Arabia for almost 80 years. So American giants like GM, GE, Bechtel, Pepsi have been in Saudi Arabia for decades and have been there from the beginning when we were first established as, modern day Saudi Arabia in the 30s and began to diversify and grow our economy. What's interesting is that as we speak today, all of these I don't want to use the word old giants, but these established companies are still in the kingdom. What's interesting, though, is that the new giants, the Oracles, Google, Amazon, Apple, are all in Saudi Arabia today to help us, push forward Vision 2030 and all of its new sectors forward. So this relationship, I think, it has endured for many reasons. I mentioned some of them. There's also, and I'd be remiss actually if I do want to also add this component. There's an important people-to-people dimension to the relationship. So as we speak, there's an estimated 70,000 Americans living and working in Saudi Arabia, many of whom have seen more of Saudi Arabia, frankly, than I have. But in my defense, I've probably seen more of the United States than most Americans. At the same time, over the years, hundreds of thousands of Saudis have come to the United States for many reasons. Many have come for their education. My late father came to the United States for his education back in the 1960s. I studied in New York back in the 1990s, and there's an estimated 25,000 Saudis currently studying in the United States. These numbers used to be, bigger some 10 years ago. I can go into the reasons why, but there's reasons that we have slightly smaller numbers, but going because we've tried to tailor our scholarship program basically to the needs of the labor market in the kingdom. So at the same time, as I mentioned the Saudi students in the United States for a reason, because while they're here primarily, obviously, to attain a formal education, many of them have actually used whatever free time they have to kind of give back to their local communities in the United States. So it's very clear to me, and that was the case even with my late father and his generation many years ago. But the Saudi students who are living in the United States, most of whom live here for at least 4 years, when you live that long, you start to treat your classmates, your neighbors, your peers as an extended part of your family. So a lot of these students are, again, using some of their free time to volunteer at hospitals, at retirement communities, at soup kitchens. There's a number of student-led organizations that have actually helped various American communities across the United States recover from natural disasters. And I'm talking about, young men and women who traveled, just as an example, to the Houston area following Hurricane Harvey several years ago. And there's footage, you can check it online on YouTube, of young men and women, Saudi men and women, helping Americans, rebuild their homes after natural disasters. And I think that says something about the depth of the relationship. And you often see when, people talk about Saudi-U.S. relations, you often hear people say that we have, common interests, and those are what bind us. And we do for sure. But I do believe strongly that it is more than just common interests. We do have common values. If we didn't, these young men and women would not, again, stay in touch with their with their American friends for decades afterwards. They would not, reach out to Americans and volunteer at some of these institutions. And then when Americans come to Saudi Arabia, by the way, by the thousands, it's my understanding, and that's my impression, is that they have a predominantly young, favorable and good experience because of the fact that Saudis and, so many Saudis have, like I said, have traveled to the United States. So many have studied in the United States. So they're warm, I think, and welcoming to Americans when they see them. If you go online, you're going to see dozens of, interesting videos of American tourists who are invited by Saudis all across Saudi Arabia. As soon as they're here, they hear they're Americans. They go out of their way to invite them to their homes for tea or coffee or dinner. A lot of them out of the fact that they spend some time in the United States, but for many of them, it's just what they do as Saudis. We take hospitality very seriously in the kingdom. So again, thank you so much for your invitation. And I think, I think I covered a fair amount of ground. But I'm looking forward to your questions and, and continuing this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. We have lots of questions in the chat, but I'm actually going to kick us off with our first one. So Saudi Arabia typically has had a lot of natural resource, oil-rich country, right? And so economists generally call that sort of a rentier economy. It provides a lot of these generous social, public sector safety sort of welfare programs. Yeah. And one of the things that creates is a situation where, market economics and productivity within a country might not reach some kind of pinnacle because it's being offset by these natural resources. And I guess what I'm curious about is in Vision 2030, how is the government trying to sort of move away from, say, that rentier economy and produce sort of like an organic, fully functioning workforce, outside of sort of other people like expatriates working there and that type of deal?
Right. No, that's a great question. And really, ultimately, the main objective of Vision 2030 is to lessen our dependence on oil revenues. Because like I said, that model worked pretty well for us 50 years ago. It is just not a viable, sustainable model for us now that our population has, essentially expanded, increased sevenfold over the past 7 years. So, some of the sectors that I included, whether it's, tourism, logistics, artificial intelligence is one sector where we are, again, slowly but surely becoming leaders. And some of the promise of artificial intelligence, I think, was on display when President Trump was in the kingdom a few months ago. And again, was the talk of many of the conversations when His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was in Washington a couple of months ago. And there was, in fact, an agreement on artificial intelligence that will make Saudi Arabia a regional hub for artificial intelligence. Because, again, in that broader conversation, what sometimes is overlooked is the AI requires a lot of energy, and we have a lot of that, but it also requires space. So we are well on our way becoming leaders in that space. And as we do that, we're generating jobs. So we're generating jobs there. We're generating jobs in tourism, in mining, in logistics, sectors like education, healthcare, all of these, banking. We've passed a lot of new regulations to make banking more accessible, to help entrepreneurs, to help business leaders. So we've empowered entrepreneurs and business leaders. We've empowered the private sector in general, because as you said, we do want the public sector to play less of a role, the government to play less of a role. So what we see our role is we've basically created the right ecosystem for the private sector, for business leaders, men, women, small businesses, medium businesses, or huge multilateral or multinational corporations. And what's interesting about the Saudi, transformation is no matter what business you're in, and then I hesitate to use the word pitch, but this is basically kind of my pitch to American, business leaders. Whatever business you're in, there's an opportunity in Saudi Arabia. So if you're in technology, there's certainly plenty of opportunities in artificial intelligence. If you're in entertainment, we are holding some of the biggest concerts, the bigger sporting events in the world. If you're in logistics, we are expanding, like I said, our ports, our seaports, our highway systems. If you are in hospitality, building some of the biggest hotels in the world. And I think you see where I'm going with that. So no matter what line of work you're in, no matter what business you're in, there's opportunities in Saudi Arabia, and maybe more opportunities there than anywhere else in the world. And that the credit really does go to our leadership that before they unveiled Vision 2030, kind of, again, conducted a very thorough survey of just the economic landscape, of our demographics, and saw that we had a lot of untapped potential. We also have a predominantly young population that is very well educated, that is very tech savvy, that is plugged in. And I hear this from, American business leaders all the time. They go in, especially the ones who are investing or opening up, factories or companies in Saudi Arabia. They say young Saudi men, but even more so, young Saudi women are extremely driven and thirsty to prove themselves. And really, this entire transformation is definitely a collective effort. So just going back to your question, I think there's certainly, the way we see it as a government is, like I said, we are laying the right ecosystem. So we have responsibilities, for sure, in terms of empowering people to succeed. At the same time, every Saudi, I think there's an expectation for every individual to also do their own, to do their part. So whether you work in the private sector, and certainly if you work in the public sector, there's expectations from our leaders who are, very, extremely hard workers. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince is known to be an extremely hard worker who operates on very little sleep. But then my own boss right here in Washington, D.C., Her Royal Highness Ambassador Rima Al Saud, she is the hardest working person that I know. And again, and I think this is true across the board in Saudi Arabia, we have predominantly young leaders who are very ambitious, and they are being supported by, again, a predominantly young population of men and women. So there's an expectation to perform. And again, our young men and women have certainly answered the call, that's for sure. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
This was a long answer, but there was quite a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you. So we'll go to next questions from Gerald Sieber. They ask, have the younger members of the religious community readily accepted the comprehensive changes in Saudi society?
Right. So again, Saudi Arabia our total population is 35 million. 14 million of whom, by the way, are non-Saudis. And this is, according to the numbers that we found last year. Now, I can't sit here and say everybody agrees on everything. You can't have a nation of much smaller size. If you have a nation of 500,000, you're bound to have a difference of opinion on certain issues. But by and large, the overwhelming majority of Saudis are absolutely supportive of what is happening in the kingdom. They're supportive of the changes, especially the social changes, the economic changes in Saudi Arabia. I think I'm privileged to go to the kingdom and to talk to some of these young leaders leading this transformation. And there is tremendous excitement in the kingdom. You see it, you hear it, you can feel it. And again, I'm privileged enough to actually accompany American delegations 4 or 5 times a year to Saudi Arabia. Sometimes they're business leaders, sometimes they're academics or think tankers. So it runs the gamut of the people that I sometimes accompany to the kingdom. And so I sit in on some of these conversations, and it's very clear to me that young Saudi men and women today are more excited about their future than ever before. And I know for a fact that in today's Saudi Arabia, if you are somebody who is a hard worker, who is willing to pay your dues, who is well educated, you can advance very, very quickly, very rapidly in either the private or public sector. So you have CEOs who are, in their, and not just tech CEOs, but even in other sectors who are in their 20s. You have government ministers who are in their 30s, and which would mean that they're younger than me. And that was not always the case. And that's a reflection, again, of the demographic reality of Saudi Arabia today. Some 65% of our population is under the age of 30. So it's a very young population that is very, very supportive of what is happening in the kingdom, of Vision 2030, of even the pace of change, which has been rapid. I think there's very, very strong support among the overwhelming majority of people who are young. And I think His Royal Highness the Crown Prince said that he said it in a very articulate manner several years ago. He said that, the pace of change over the years was okay, but it was just too slow. And just given the world that we live in today, we are going to be left behind if we don't accelerate the pace of change. So the change has been rapid, and for many, many compelling reasons, because it's a very fast-moving world that we live in, and it has the support of the overwhelming majority of Saudi people, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question, I'm going to combine a couple from Kelly Kohler. So she's asking about, you talked a lot about tourism. She's asking about the consequences for that on the middle class specifically, and then also how the current presidential administration in the United States has impacted the tourism market.
Right. So, tourism, as far as I'm concerned, is, like I said, it's a win-win. It generates revenues. It generates jobs. It allows us, obviously, to diversify our economy. It allows people to come in and to have a better understanding of who we are as a people. And, I'm no longer in my 30s or 40s for that matter, but, as I get up there in age a little bit, there's one thing I still strongly believe in, is that, with all these different, amazing technologies that we have, for my money, there's still nothing more rewarding than traveling in person and visiting a place for the first time. And I say that, I think that's probably true anywhere, but it's certainly, I think, the case in Saudi Arabia, where, again, for many years, we were just not that accessible, but we are now. And like I said, I have the pleasure of accompanying American delegations several times a year. And every time I go, at least one person, it's usually, obviously, the person who's never been to Saudi Arabia, and this usually happens within the first 24 hours or so, will pull me aside and say, I'm so glad I came to Saudi Arabia, because I heard and read so much, but reality is so much different. And we have much more in common than I ever thought was the case. So this is so rewarding to hear. It's so heartening to hear. And that's why we're going to continue to invest in our tourism sector, because, like I said, generates jobs, revenues, creates, it just allows better understanding between people. And, I often, I talk to a lot of audiences. I do speaking engagements like this, but I've done everything from live CNN to, local radio in Wichita, Kansas, both of which were amazing and incredible. But we also have a lot of people that come into the embassy for like a visitors program. So I speak to a lot of students, high school and college. And what I tell them is that, if you have a chance to travel, do yourself a favor and do it, because you're always going to be, I think, a better person. You're going to have, your horizons are going to broaden every time you go to a new country. And that's been our experience in Saudi Arabia. And again, as I think I mentioned this in my remarks, we take hospitality very seriously. I think it's part of our culture. It's ingrained into who we are as Arabs and, frankly, as Muslims. So if you are in Saudi Arabia, and like I said, people will come out and they can usually tell who is not a local. They'll go out of their way. They want to make sure that to make people feel welcome. And, these videos are captured on a daily basis, basically, of Americans and, people from all over the world traveling across Saudi Arabia, getting to know us, sharing a meal. And like I said, as far as we're concerned, that's a win-win for everybody all around, for sure.
And the Trump administration's current policies haven't affected that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's become very clear to anyone who's following U.S.-Saudi relationship that President Trump, I think, greatly, one, values the bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think it really says something that the president has made Saudi Arabia his first overseas destination, both in his first term, but also in his second term. He spoke, I think he had some very kind words to say about the transformation actually in Saudi Arabia, because I think the president visited the kingdom back in 2017 in his first term and again last year. So he saw that transformation over the past 8 years or so and was again very kind in saying that, he saw visible changes, but I think he's been very complimentary of our leadership, specifically His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, in saying and appreciating the fact that he is a visionary leader. I think there's an appreciation for the role that Saudi Arabia plays in the region, in the Arab world, and the broader Muslim world as a stabilizing force, as a force that has promoted peace and stability and prosperity, as an investor and as a partner of so many different American companies. There's tremendous Saudi investments in the United States, and His Royal Highness, when he was here, said that potentially, over the next few years, we can be talking about as much as $1 trillion worth of, investments and various, trade deals with various American companies, whether it's, energy, yes, because we're still going to continue to produce oil for the simple fact that there's still demand. But there's new partnerships on renewables, whether it's solar, wind, or otherwise. There's a lot of partnerships in artificial intelligence, in cybersecurity, in supply chain resilience, and the list goes on and on. And I think what I should have mentioned about the relationship with the United States is, I think I mentioned that it's longstanding, it's multidimensional, it's continued to strengthen and to deepen over the years. But it's also, what's interesting, I think is interesting, is the fact that it's also continued to evolve. So yes, the pillars of the relationship are still there. Security cooperation, economic cooperation, energy cooperation. These are still pillars, they're still there. But like I said, we've kind of expanded beyond that. So whether it's artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, supply chain resilience, space exploration, these are kind of new areas of cooperation, but I think they're frankly equally as important these days, because this is where, our economy, and by our, I mean the international economy, has changed over the years. And so these are some of the sectors that are kind of leading, the global economy. And so I think it's a testament to the relationship that it's not only endured, but evolved. And I think President Trump, certainly in all his actions and his remarks, whether in Saudi Arabia or here in Washington, D.C., I think he appreciates the role that the kingdom plays. And for our part, Saudi Arabia obviously greatly appreciates the role that President Trump plays in the broader, international community. We appreciate the role that the United States plays. We always see and think of the United States as a force for good, as a critical player in promoting peace, prosperity, and stability around the world.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two other questions from the chat, both dealing with climate change. Kelly asks, in the Middle East, particularly is the Middle East in agreement with Saudi Arabia's regional interest in green energy? And Randall follows that up with, doesn't climate change involve a transition away from fossil fuels? And what is Saudi Arabia's plan for this? When and how fast will it begin to cut back on oil and gas production?
Right. So we believe that obviously, there is a transition globally coming at some point. However, we also believe that as oil producers, we have a responsibility to make sure that this is a gradual transition that does not create, mass economic dislocation. So we believe that we still have a responsibility to produce oil and natural gas for the simple reason that that demand is still very robust. And so as we speak, the daily demand in terms of barrels of oil is approximately 100 million barrels of oil a day. Much of the global economy still runs on oil. So we will continue to do that because, like I said, we believe that we have a responsibility to make sure that that supply is still adequate. At the same time, we have fully embraced the fact that, we have new sources of renewable energy. Clean energy is very important. Like I said, we believe that climate change is a real threat. And that's why we are investing heavily in solar, wind, and other renewables. So we don't see these two policies as contradictory. We're kind of moving in two tracks, but kind of moving towards the same goal, which is providing, energy security and supply, basically, but also making sure that the energy that we provide is as clean as possible. So it's not a coincidence, it's not by accident that Aramco, which is our national energy company, it produces both, crude and natural gas, has some of the lowest carbon intensity when it comes to the products it sells anywhere in the world. That's by design because, like I said, we do take, we believe that we have the responsibility to provide adequate supplies of crude, but also natural gas. But we also have I think every country has a responsibility to mitigate the impact of climate change and to do its part. So I think we're doing both. And we don't see these two policies as contradictory. On the contrary, we see them as complementary in many ways.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Next question comes from Randall Newell, and I think it's a good question. Empowering Saudi society is a key goal of Vision 2030. Will that involve a gradual shift to more democracy?
Right. Thank you. So that's a good question. So certainly, I think I mentioned in my remarks that one of the main goals of Vision 2030 is the empowerment of all our citizens. So Vision 2030 is a collective endeavor. Its goals and also the key to successes is the empowerment of men, young men, youth, women, entrepreneurs, business leaders. But not only that, we have programs in place to make sure that, people with disabilities, people with special needs can also feel that they can be productive members of society. So that's one. Now, in terms of our political institutions, Saudi Arabia over the years has undergone tremendous changes. Our political institutions have changed over the years and evolved, I would say, but they have served us well over the years. So we are not a democracy, we are a monarchy. But we do have political institutions in place that allow for several things. One, they have allowed for, obviously, input going into decision making. So we have, we have an institution that is called the Shura Council, and it's basically our legislative body. Now, this legislative body was initially formed just to give you an example, in 1990. Back then, it had only 60 members and no women. Today, it has 30%. It has 150 members total. It has 30% women. It represents every region of Saudi Arabia. But not only that, the membership of that body is essentially comprised of subject matter experts across a very broad gamut of sectors. So you have doctors, engineers, educators, business leaders, and all of them, their input goes into the decision-making process. So they hold hearings, They hold hearings of various ministers. The ministers come in and basically talk about the objectives of their various ministries. The same is true of the Council of Ministers, which again is comprised of people with demonstrated expertise. And our leaders solicit that input from all these different institutions. So that has worked very well for us. But again, that is not to say that some of these institutions have not changed over the years. And I think the Shura Council is a good example. As as our economy has changed over the years, as our our population has increased dramatically, some of these political institutions have evolved a little bit. But overall, we believe that we have good political institutions that have served us well over the years. And the ultimate proof of the efficacy of our political institutions is the fact that Saudi Arabia has been incredibly stable throughout its history in a region that is unfortunately sometimes defined by its instability. That's not by accident. I think that really speaks volumes about the wisdom of our leadership, but also the importance of our political institutions, that they have been able to, we've been able to weather some of these storms around us when, frankly, many of our neighbors haven't over the years.
All right. Moving on to a foreign policy question. Has there been any pressure to intervene in any recent conflicts? For example, the Israel-Palestine conflict. Is neutrality the best option to deal with foreign affairs?
Right. So I think I mentioned that we do not interfere in the domestic affairs of our neighbors. That's one of our pillars of our foreign policy. At the same time, many of the crises in the region, obviously, I think all of them, frankly, I can't think of a single crisis in the region or anywhere else in the world that doesn't have ripple effects, whether it's in the form of violence spilling over borders or refugees being, spilling over again to neighboring countries. Since, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was mentioned, obviously this conflict, I think, we've long maintained that for the Middle East to enjoy any semblance of peace, prosperity, that this core conflict really needs to be resolved. It's brought so much pain and suffering to both Palestinians and Israelis, but it's also been exploited by the most radical militant elements, whether it's Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or others over the years. So what we've done, and our position on it has been clear and consistent for decades. And in fact, it was the late King Abdullah who presented way back in 2002 what is now known as the Arab Peace Initiative. And the Arab Peace Initiative basically offers Israel not just, recognition from Saudi Arabia, but all 21 member states of the League of Arab States, all of whom signed on to it, basically all in exchange for a full and comprehensive peace with the Palestinians based on a two-state solution. So a two-state solution, two states living side by side in peace, security, and dignity, frankly, has always been the way forward as far as we're concerned. And, I don't want to simplify this too much, but like I said, this has been a critical conflict, brought a lot of pain and suffering. If I want to simplify it, it basically comes down to this. The two-state solution essentially offers Israel security in exchange for dignity for the Palestinians. I think it's a fair exchange. I think it's a reasonable exchange. And all the other solutions over the years have not been very practical. So we'll continue to work with our neighbors. We're continuing to work with we're still very supportive of the Palestinian leaders, primarily, exclusively, I should say, in the Palestinian Authority. We're very supportive of President Trump's efforts to resolve this conflict. We're supportive of his 20 point plan in Gaza. We're working closely with the administration on that. But really, this conflict really needs to be resolved once and for all. Otherwise, I think the region really is going to have a very difficult time becoming, peaceful and stable without it being resolved. Because, like I said, we have a very clear vision for Saudi Arabia and its future. We are well on our way in terms of implementing Vision 2030. But I think we also have a vision for the Middle East. And the vision is, simply put, is where it's for the Middle East to be a region at peace with itself and to be fully economically integrated. Some people compare it to Europe, and I guess that's one model, one way of looking at it. And we believe that there's tremendous potential for that, because there's tremendous potential in every single Arab country with no exception. Where we're talking about, Sudan, Libya, Yemen, certainly in the Palestinian territories, you name it. Tremendous potential there, but I think the international community needs to be supportive, to provide political support, sometimes financial support, to push for political dialogue. We're doing our part. Again, out of the belief that there's tremendous potential there. And, Sudan being at peace, Yemen being peaceful, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict being resolved, these are all not just beneficial for the people most directly involved, but they would have, it would pay dividends in terms of peace and stability for the broader international community, for sure.
Thank you. And as long as you're willing, we have a couple more questions. We might go a little over 1 o'clock, but I think there's a couple more that are worth asking.
Sure.
So Randall asks, considering the high tension between Trump and his political opponents in the United States, are you worried that if your country is too close to Trump personally, it could lead to a backlash from Democrats, especially if they were to take power in the future?
Right. So our leaders have said all along is that, and I think I mentioned that in my opening remarks as well, is that's a great thing about this relationship, is that, frankly, regardless of who's in the White House, the relationship over the past 80 years has continued to be on a positive trajectory, in the sense that it's continued to deepen and to broaden and to strengthen under both Democratic and Republican administrations. So whether it was, President Clinton, President Obama, President Biden, President Bush, President Trump, that relationship has continued. So that political cooperation has continued uninterrupted. The military cooperation has continued and strengthened, I would say, uninterrupted. The economic cooperation, the trade, the investments have continued uninterrupted over the past 80 years, not just uninterrupted, but they've actually strengthened and broadened. So these things are concrete. You can measure them. The same is true for political cooperation. So all of these different dimensions have continued. And I think that's the ultimate testament that it really, whoever is in the White House, I think whoever the president is, that's been our experience, is that, whoever the president is, they maybe, if not on day one, then fairly soon after they take office, they develop an appreciation for the importance of the relationship with the kingdom. I think they develop an appreciation for the very unique role that Saudi Arabia plays in the Arab world, and for the very unique role that Saudi Arabia plays in the broader Muslim world, as well as a very important role that we play in the energy space.
Appreciate that answer. Just a couple more. So Edward Phillipson asks, what about human rights concerns and the role of religious authorities in the country?
Right. So the protection of human rights is very important to us. It is consistent with our faith. People, treating people with dignity is very consistent and really a basic tenet of Islam. It is also enshrined in our laws. It's enshrined in our basic law, which is equivalent to our constitution. But we were also signatories to dozens of international agreements, conventions that protect the rights of women, that protect the rights of children, that protect the rights of senior citizens, people with disabilities, people with special needs. We've passed dozens of laws that protect the rights of workers, all sorts of workers, white collar, blue collar, laborers, to make sure that they know and understand what their rights are. We have a Human Rights Commission in Saudi Arabia that investigates alleged human rights violations. What is also interesting, there's a couple of data points that I also like to mention. I think I already mentioned I already mentioned both of them, but I'll repeat them because I think they have applications here. I think they speak volumes in terms of, there's a perception of human rights conditions in Saudi Arabia, but the reality is that, as I said, our population is 35 million, 14 million of whom are non-Saudis. Some of these people have been living in Saudi Arabia for years, possibly decades. At the same time, so these people who've been living in the kingdom for decades, or for years for sure, would not stay in Saudi Arabia if we did not respect people's basic human rights. At the same time, these millions of people who are coming in as tourists would not be coming in if their experience was unpleasant, or if we did not treat people with respect, and if we were not welcoming of all sorts of people from all sorts of walks of life. Like I said, millions of tourists would not be coming in to visit, and millions of expats would not stay year after year after year if we were not respectful of their rights as basic human rights, and treated them with the dignity, regardless of their backgrounds, religious, national, or otherwise.
Thank you. And maybe you can give a little follow-up to this next question. I think it's along the same lines. Anita Jester asks, are girls and boys getting equal education opportunities?
Thank you. That's a great question. So the empowerment of women is both, I would say, an objective of Vision 2030, but it is also one of the keys to its success, because the majority of our population is women. I think some 52% of our population is women. The majority of college students are women. Some 40% of business owners last year are women. So you have women in every sector of Saudi Arabia. You have, women diplomats. And my own boss, Her Royal Highness Princess Rima Bandar Al Saud, was the first woman ambassador when she was appointed back in 2019. But we've had 5 or 6 women ambassadors appointed since. In the past 6 years, we have had, we have women CEOs. We have women who are, heads of faculty departments at various universities. We have women in every sector of the economy. We have women athletes of every kind. We have women in the military services. We have women in the security services. We sent the first Saudi woman to space last year, and she was part of the International Space Station. So the empowerment of women is absolutely critical to the success of Vision 2030. Year after year, we spend about 20% of our budget on education. So we're building state-of-the-art institutions, but also incorporating all these technologies into the classroom. And absolutely, women, young girls are integral and critical. Whatever we spend on boys' education, we're spending on girls' education. We've opened every sector, like I said. We've opened every discipline to women in colleges, out of the belief that Her Royal Highness is I'm technically the spokesperson, but really she is a very gifted and eloquent spokesperson in her own right, definitely when it comes to the empowerment of women, just because she speaks very frankly about some of the challenges that she faced when she was in the private sector some 10, 15 years ago. But we've come a long way. I think we've made great strides in terms of narrowing the gender gap. We are not there yet. But in our defense, I am not aware of any country where that gender gap is completely eliminated. But we are definitely, like I said, we've made great strides. We're on the right track. And, you hear from Saudi women that this is they see this as their time. And I certainly hear it from American business leaders and company owners who set up shop in the kingdom, that they love the Saudi women who work with them because they're hard workers, they're ambitious, and as the father of a 16-year-old daughter myself, I agree with that, and certainly more than happy to hear that.
Thank you so much for your presentation today and for answering all of our questions and engaging in this dialogue. I'm now going to turn it back over to Lynn Brown, who's going to close things out and also have a couple announcements from the World Affairs Council.
Thank you.
Fahad, thank you so much for your taking time today to spend with us and for engaging in the dialogue we've had. I think it's been very beneficial.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I'd like to just announce our next program coming up is booked for February 11th at the McGlynn Conference Center.